Expert speakers with us. I'll introduce them briefly and then I'll start with a few questions, but I invite you all to already start thinking of great questions to ask our eminent speakers. So Conroy Cantor, the producer of the film Trafficked that you just saw, has just been come back from Cannes and is literally going around the world with the film Trafficked and raising awareness on the issue. So thanks a lot for being here tonight. Kevin Bells, a professor of contemporary slavery at the University of Nottingham and co-author of the Global Slavery Index, which estimates that there are 40.3 million people living in modern slavery around the world today. Thanks for being with us, Kevin, tonight. And Nick Rono is the CEO of the Freedom Fund, one of the leading organizations in the global movement to end modern slavery. Thanks a lot, Nick, for being with us. So I'll start with a quick question, Conroy, to link to the film. We heard Siddharth Kara's motivation with the film, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the background to the film, your motivation, and why you decided to do a feature film rather than a documentary.
Thank you. Well, a producer friend of mine came to me and said she had a script on human trafficking, and I, like most people, said, "Oh, what's that?" Well, I soon found out. So after I got through page 10, it kept me in the movie. And the first 10 minutes of the movie are so important. So that's my cutoff. If a script doesn't hold my attention, I move on. But this one held my attention. And so we raised the money, we started the shoot, and I just feel that so many people see feature films. I love documentaries, but we want to reach as many people as possible. I know the film is very hard to watch, but these men can tell you it's much worse. The true stories are much worse. And as a mother, I had to do this film. I could not sit on the sidelines any longer.
Thanks very much, Conroy. To know a little bit more about the issue, I want to suggest now turning to Kevin, who I wonder if you could share a little bit of your research on the scale and scope of the issue of human trafficking or modern slavery around the world, and maybe give us a sense of what's the scale in Europe, according to your research, and at least what you can tell us. Thank you.
I'm happy to tell you anything, if I happen to know it. There are about, as you said, something like 40.3 million people in the world in slavery. We think that's a conservative estimate. I think an important thing to know is that that's every single country. We don't find any countries that don't have slavery, except possibly the tiniest little island countries where we don't even have any measurements at all. But 99.9% of the world's population have been in countries where we've been able to take measurements, and we come to something like 40.3 million. In Europe, the numbers are high, but not as high as they happen to be in some of the poorest countries. The countries that have the highest proportion of their populations in slavery are countries like Mauritania, which we think has perhaps 4% of the entire population is in slavery. Haiti, which is something like 2% of the entire population. We sort of put North Korea off to the side because it's both very hard to measure, and we suspect that the percentage is very high indeed if you count the enslavement by the North Korean government. So it's a bit of a dark space there. In Europe, the proportion of people in slavery in the countries is very small as a proportion, but it still comes to hundreds of thousands, if not something like 1 million or 1.1 million across all the states of Europe. I say possibly simply because it's actually much harder to measure the number of people in slavery in rich countries than it is in poor countries. And so that's one of the challenges that we have. We now have some new techniques which are being adopted across European governments, which are giving us much more accurate numbers. So if you'll ask me again in 2 years, I could probably give you a much better number. What we certainly know is that European countries have often said, slavery, trafficking, what's that? And we find that the amount of investment by governments in enforcing the laws against trafficking and slavery are very, very low, considering the size of the crime, and also considering the fact that many European countries, if they invested a reasonable amount of resources, could become slave-free countries, or they could aspire to becoming slave-free. So it's a good question, is why are there slaves at all in a country like Norway, for example? I work with the Norwegian government sometimes. Why do they have any? When they have great police, no corruption, a small population, good border. I mean, it's surprising that they even have the hundreds that they have, the few hundreds that they have.
Thank you very much. So we look forward to having another conversation about this in 2 years when we'll be back with more. Nick.
Conroy's next.
With Conroy's next one.
Which is about anti-slavery heroes like Nick.
Nick, the issue of human trafficking or modern slavery has been receiving a lot more attention in the media. I mentioned when we started the discussion the video that was released by CNN and that shocked many of us, at least here in Belgium. I'm wondering why is it getting more attention today and whether it has positive and or negative impact?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's difficult to watch a movie like this, isn't it? It's extremely confronting. I work on these issues on a daily basis and I find this difficult to watch. But it does powerfully demonstrate the essence of what modern-day slavery is about, which is about extreme abuse of power to exploit people to make profit. And it can be for sex trafficking, it can be for labour trafficking. I go to places like India, where I see whole families being exploited in stone quarries or in brick kilns. I was in Thailand at the end of last year meeting Burmese migrants who had been enslaved and subject to horrendous violence on fishing boats in Thailand that produces the seafood that ends up on our supermarket shelves. And I've been to, like Kevin, I'm sure, been to brothels for work in Mumbai that made this place in Texas look like a holiday resort, you know, just kind of industrial scale exploitation. And I think it's challenging because you see this and then you hear the numbers, 40 million people in slavery. Of that, the estimate is about 5 million people 5 million women, predominantly women and girls, in sex slavery. And I think it begs the question, well, what can you do? But there is a positive story. It's the only way that certainly I keep going when we're dealing with issues like this, that over the last 5 or 6 years we're seeing a real momentum around this issue from a very low base, but we're beginning to see governments, particularly Western governments, really lift the scale of their attention on this. In the UK, where I live, the Prime Minister has come out and said this is the greatest human rights issue of our time. I mean, even in the US, with all the messed up politics in the US, both presidents and political leaders on both sides of the fence have declared that fighting human trafficking is a priority across the political divide. And we're seeing those kinds of things. I was at a gathering at the Vatican 4 years ago where the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a whole range of religious leaders came together to declare this a priority for their congregations, their faiths. We're seeing business leaders, and I think it creates, in an ideal world, it creates a momentum where you know there is more interest and then more ability for producers and activists to bring these stories to the public's attention. But I also think it's really important not to fool yourselves that just raising awareness is enough. You know, this is a fundamental abuse of power. I mean, the only part of that story that I think is really compressed is that last part where the police kind of swoop in, because all too rarely that's not the way it works, right? All too rarely, police departments don't prioritise this issue. Politicians, you know, even though there's more attention, aren't prioritising it. There aren't the resources. There isn't the willingness to engage. So there needs to be continual pressure. There needs to be greater awareness, but awareness then translates into mobilisation, political pressure, consumer pressure, pressure on businesses. I mean, people in Brussels all have, you know, not all, but many are engaged in the political space. There are ways in which that can be leveraged to produce greater action and policy action. We need to see all of those levers being applied to make continue the momentum that we're seeing.
I have been going around. I've been going to colleges. I was at Pepperdine University. We're working with Mount Royal College in Calgary, Canada, to, you know, have films like Trafficked part of their curriculum to teach our teenagers how to respect women, and that you're not for sale. A child is not for sale. We have different types of screenings where we have NGOs involved, so when the audience asks questions, what can I do in my neighborhood, in my city, then there's someone they can talk to. And you have 3 different NGOs here, I believe, in Brussels, that you are doing, you know, on the ground work. So, I mean, there are places to go and help. Also, I've had survivors that speak after we show the movie, because I know it's hard, and I'm sorry it's hard, but I just feel like it's a story that needs to be told. And I mean, I've had young girls in Long Beach, California, where, you know, they were being sold to their uncle's friends. This is a family problem.
What can we do to prevent, to respond to this issue? Are there resources or way that we actually know that what we're consuming is not a profiting network, or other initiatives that we can do to help raise awareness or help prevent the scale of human trafficking?
Yeah, there are many things we can do. And I think one of the things that's very important to understand, though, is to look at our anti-slavery history. This is actually the 4th anti-slavery movement in human history. The first one started in 1787. There were 2 since then. This one started in the early 1990s. And now the only key difference is that the previous movements were to end legal slavery, and this movement is trying to end slavery. But one of the things that, if you look at the history of our previous anti-slavery movements, you discover that the governments are pretty hopeless. They were pretty hopeless at the time. They tend to come to the idea of freedom and liberation last. When the war is almost won, they show up, unfortunately. Laws are very important, but they often come very late. NGOs are very small. It takes a long time to build them. Awareness raising is good, but it only does something to us who are in freedom, not to the people in slavery. And the total impact of slavery in our consumption is crucially important, but it's actually very small. In other words, we do and should feel moral responsibility at a distance for people who supply us with slave labor and do the things that we buy. But the amount of the total economy represented by slave labor is minuscule. So what do you do if you want to end slavery? What you do is you support organizations like Freedom Fund that get people out of slavery and invest directly in the system of liberation and reintegration and rehabilitation. I very strongly believe this because I've worked in this 20 years. I've seen an awful lot of talk in places like, I wouldn't say Brussels, but maybe Geneva. But I have to say that when I see people coming to freedom, it's not usually the governments. It's not usually about just raising awareness. It's about people who've said, we're going to put our lives and our resources on the line, and we're going to find the people in slavery, and we're going to figure out what we have to do to help them come to freedom. And that's exactly what Nick's organization does, and there are several others around the world that do very well with that. But that's where I'm going to put my bet, is how do we actually get out there and fix it? Not just learn about it, not just watch out for whether we bought a funny shirt or not, but actually invest even a tiny bit. Now, can I give you some very good news? The very good news is this. 40 million people in the world in slavery is the smallest fraction of the global population to ever be in slavery by an enormous margin. The $150 billion in slave business every year is by far the tiniest fraction of the global economy of something like $12 trillion per year. It's minuscule. It's a drop in the ocean. It's against the law in every country, except for Boko Haram and ISIS. No actual religious groups or foundations support slavery. People are convinced across the world that this is morally wrong and must be brought to an end. We have the mechanisms worked through. Freedom Fund in particular is doing amazing work in monitoring and evaluation and building machines that get people out of slavery. And we can calculate how much it costs and how much it might cost to get everyone in the world out of slavery. And it comes in around 30 billion. It's approximate, but it's around 30 billion. Now 30 billion is what gets spent on movie tickets in a year, in not just the world, just the rich part of the world. And it wouldn't be 30 billion a year, it'd be 30 billion over about 20 or 30 years to bring slavery to an end. What I'm telling you is simply this: we can fix this. We can get rid of this like we're getting rid of smallpox. It's actually possible. 30 billion buys you an aircraft carrier, or it buys you liberation for millions of people.
At risk of there being a bit of a mutual admiration society, Kevin is one of the true champions of the anti-slavery space, and it was his book that I first read when I came into this space, and he and I worked together on the very first global slavery index, and it's because of work like him and others that we are seeing this momentum, and there is reason to hope, but a lot more needs to be done, and sometimes I think, the awareness part is tremendously important in understanding that crime is so prevalent. And so I used to work for government, I used to be a commercial lawyer, I used to work for Goldman Sachs, so I have a fairly strong understanding of the commercial environment. And I look at things like legislation around bribery and corruption. In Europe, in the UK and the US, we have really strong laws on bribery and corruption, whereby if you're a senior executive and there is bribery that happens way down the chain of your corporate entity, you as a senior executive can be sent to jail. And this is bribery and corruption. But at the moment, if that happens way down the chain, if you run a major corporation and directly responsible for exploitation that happens all the way down in the spinning mills in India or in Bangladesh or on the fishing boats, there's almost no consequences. So I think, we have to start thinking about some of these kind of parallels and some of the lessons of the past, or the environmental movement, I think, probably has lots of lessons for us. 30, 40, 50 years ago, there were no consequences for spewing out chemicals into rivers and massive pollution on a grand scale. And pressure and mobilisation and smart political action helped change all of this. And when we're talking about a fairly fundamental exploitation of people's lives, so it is doable. It needs pressure, it needs the external pressure on governments, it needs consumers to ask questions. I don't think we put the responsibility on consumers in the sense of, it's your responsibility not just to buy these things, but you can ask questions and you can ask companies that you engage with, what are their policies on conflict minerals, which are produced by slaves, or do you have a policy when it comes to exploitative labour, and just push the barrier. But in the end, we need to change the incentives that make slavery so profitable and make the costs of being prosecuted or held accountable for slavery so low. We have to change that. It's hugely profitable and almost no risk, and we have to switch that around.
I might open up now to the audience to see if there are any questions. There's Fanny and Sylvain who are there with mics, and if you just lift your hand, if not, I'll continue asking questions. But Yes, in the back there, Penny. Thank you so much.
Yes, I would like to speak about slavery that is actually, you can meet these people who run away from the slavery of their country. There are in Belgium about 400, 600, in France 1,000, 2,000. It's young people who is running away from the kind of more modern slavery which is harming their country. It's people from Eritrea. It's young people who explain to Belgium like me and others. They go at home and sleep. We go to pick them up, let them sleep, and then they come again in the park, in the North Station. They explain that in their country, women and boys, when they are 15, 16, they are forced to make military service, and after that, they are forced to stay in the army. And in the army, what they explain is terrible. It's real slavery. They cannot come back at home, visit their parents. They must work in civilian works, like building bridges or making roads, without being paid. The rate of what they are paid is just to live inside the army. So they are run away, and if they come back, they are put in prison. So, for example, some of them, they don't want to join the army, and they cut their finger there, because if this finger is cut, they cannot shoot with the guns. Or they send bullets in their foot in order not to go in the army. And these people are coming here, young boys and young girls. They don't get the asylum because our country in Europe say that they don't have any right to ask the asylum because there is no problem in the country. So I would like to know what do you think about this governmental slavery.
Thank you very much. Thanks for mentioning this case of Eritrea.
Eritrea has one of the most repressive governments in the world, a very close second to North Korea, and in fact the situation is not only worse but more complicated. For instance, there's a big Canadian mining company called Nevson, which is mining in Eritrea and uses the forced labour provided by government, allegedly. There was a case going ahead now against Nevson. So, you know, not only are you seeing exploitation in the country, but you're seeing big multinationals then potentially benefiting from this exploitation. So Nevson is being sued in the Canadian courts for benefiting from this exploitation. I think it's a real challenge. A real challenge when it comes to asylum policy. I find it very difficult to understand that anyone could be sent back to Eritrea without a clear understanding of very, very serious consequences. But then we just need to find ways to push our governments to have more humane asylum policies, because otherwise we end up with the problem on our doorstep as well.
Eritrea is not the only country with what we call state-sponsored slavery. Obviously, North Korea is very, very obviously so. Uzbekistan, which is a country we don't think about a lot, but in fact puts a lot of the cotton into the shirts that we wear. You may not know that the high school students and the college students and a lot of the population of Uzbekistan are driven into the fields, the cotton fields, by force every year to harvest the cotton by hand, which is absurd in a modern world where we have machines that won't harvest cotton. Myanmar used to have, and still does, have some state-sponsored slavery. It's not an unusual thing, and it's certainly not, shouldn't be a big surprise in the land of King Leopold to learn about state-sponsored slavery, since it's the sad history of Belgium that it took part in a genocide and an enslavement of over 10 million people in the Congo. A long time.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Kate, thank you.
Thank you.
an amazing film, very emotional and really hard-hitting. And you know, this is an area I've worked in for a long time, and still it gets you. So thank you very much for this. In terms of governments, I absolutely agree that the government policy is not always up there in terms of the slavery history, very slow to action, and something that needs to be done much better. In terms of preventing re-trafficking, how do governments act in the best interests of victims to prevent this? So both if somebody stays in the country, so in the UK, so if somebody's been trafficked and it's deemed best for them to stay in the UK, how do we protect them and make sure that they're not going back into an environment where they're vulnerable and they're going to be trafficked again? And also, if they go back to their home country, how do we make sure we protect them? Thank you.
It's a great question, and there's only a few countries that are even close to getting it right. Though I think the UK is moving there more quickly because there are things in the House of Lords now and also in Parliament that may adjust that system. One of the key things is that when you're enslaved, what is stolen from you is all of your labor. So you come out of slavery or trafficking, and you're literally destitute. You don't have a penny. And yet, to make a life, you must have a penny. And what very often, just as the girls in this film showed, they were on their way to education, and they knew that they wanted education, and they knew they wanted skills. So the countries that do this best think of it from their perspective. So surprisingly, the United States, from a law that was passed back in 2000, when it's shown that you've been caught up in trafficking, and you get basically a certificate that says so, you are suddenly eligible for a whole series of supports, including bringing your relatives into the United States so that they won't be threatened by the traffickers. Likewise, India has a very strong law, which isn't always enforced well, but it's a very strong law that says once it's been demonstrated that you've been freed from situations of enslavement or debt bondage, then you will automatically become eligible for a grant of funds, which is enough to actually start a little business if you want to. And you also become eligible for a free land grant and for free education, free medical care, exactly what you need to get onto your feet. What I can tell you from the people I know who have come out of slavery, and I've known a lot of people who have come out of slavery, is that slaves know how to work. Now that sounds absurd, but when people are caught in slavery and forced to work, they have this opportunity and freedom to work for themselves and for their own families, and boy, do they go for it. I mean, what you see when people come out of slavery is not a kind of pathetic collapse. What you see is a burst of energy and creativity, very often. Sometimes the pain and the suffering is too much and recovery is needed. But you will see this tremendous, people who come out of slavery are actually very good for economy. They create jobs, they do jobs, and they want to get their children out of any risk of that as well. And they'll do anything to keep them in education. So, you know, what we forget is that in many ways, people who end up in slavery or in trafficking are just like us. It's just they made a wrong turn or they got turned wrongly, and we've managed to avoid that. And what we would want if we had been caught up in a bad situation when we came to freedom is exactly what they want.
When I started working on, when I started working on this issue, one of the things that it kind of really struck me is that we often think that when people are enslaved and then they're liberated from the physical confinement, they are thereby free. And I think, and the movie illustrates this, but what happens when you are trafficked or enslaved is that there is a destruction of trust. You know, I mean, if you look at this movie, it was, you know, it was the girl coming out of the foster care home, and a friend who was looking after her, who betrayed the trust, and it was for Marley, it was the religious elders that, you know, were complicit in her exploitation. And so when people come out of the physical confinement, they're by no means free, because there is massive mental trauma and there is this kind of effort that has to be done to help build trust and help build kind of mental capacity. So I think one of the things that's really important is just to understand that, you know, liberation just doesn't start when you're outside the kind of locked room, but in fact is an ongoing process. And some of the most vulnerable are those that have come out of trafficking. When we, in the organisation I work for over the last 4 years, we've helped liberate directly about 16,000 people. But we count liberation as whether or not they're still free 6 or 12 months later, because it's not enough just to say they've come out of the place of exploitation. There has to be continued follow-up to understand whether or not they have been able to stay out of the hands of exploiters.
The same thing when I went to Kathmandu with the American Himalayan Foundation. I visited many shelters, and I thought I was going to see these young women just broken and sad and dead in the eye, but it was the complete opposite. They were so full of life, and all they wanted to do was to help the next girl that came in, to get her on her feet and show, hey, you survived, you can do better, and you're safe now. And it's wonderful to see.
I saw 2 other questions here.
Thank you. That was brutal. Thank you for sponsoring this movie. It was painful to watch it. Just 2 brief questions. So one, could you say a little bit about roughly how you measure how many slaves there are in a nation? That was the first one. And secondly, this Freedom Fund, do you buy people out of slavery? Can you tell us a little bit about how this actually works? Thank you.
Measurement to you.
We have to use a whole series of, I don't want to go into all the statistical nerdy stuff because, yeah, it's just, I want to warn you, you ask a nerd like me a question like that, I could just go wild on you. Yeah. But the short answer is, we use different methods for different types of countries. You can actually use random sample surveys in poorer countries. We use something else called multiple systems estimation in rich countries. And then we use every other way of collecting data that we can possibly do, including building algorithms for those countries where we can't do direct measurements yet, that we build out of predictive modeling according to why people might be vulnerable to enslavement, that we learn from the countries where we can measure. So if you look at Global Slavery Index online, you can find a whole section of Statsy methodology papers that most people don't want to look at, but you might.
What we do at the Freedom Fund is we work with local organisations in what we call high prevalence countries, so places like Ethiopia or India or Nepal, Thailand, because the local organisations are really close to the problem. They know the traffickers, they know the victims, they know how the corruption works, and we fund them, we bring them together, because working together they're far, far more powerful. So one organisation might bring people out of a stone quarry or a brick kiln, and another will work on mental trauma or providing them with skills so that they can actually get gainful employment. But that's just the kind of entry level. What you find is that you have so much more credibility when you are, both when you're a local organisation speaking at the state capital, trying to persuade politicians in India or Nepal to change their policies. It's much more powerful if it comes from the grassroots up. But also we bring our partners out to places like the United Nations or to meet with the UK government, and then I go and meet with, go and speak at the UN or whatever, off the back of, you know, the credibility that comes from working with those that really understand the problem. And that way you can drive change, you can change the systems over time.
Thank you. Hugo. Actually, there are 2 questions. We may just take the 2 in one go.
Small question and a comment. It's a very, very basic question. How would actually define slavery? I mean, does it mean, if it's about stealing someone's work, does it mean that it's enough to have a very low salary to define it not as slavery? I mean, someone who works with extreme poverty, with basic or no rights, that's qualified as slave for part of work. And then the comment that I was really struck in the movie by how in such a connected world like our world, even this Indian girl who comes from a relatively wealthy family can disappear. And even when you have, because I mean, the other two cases correspond more to the poor, I mean, to the survivors of the surviving about this, I mean. So, but in that case, it sounds really surprising that I mean, I would believe, but still surprised by how much someone with wealthy parents and probably a network of friends can simply disappear. You know?
Hi, thank you very much. I think for this has been kind of striking, but at the same time it's good to reflect upon a subject like that, which is far from what we live in our daily life. But I would like to go back to the angle that the film kind of catch, which is the link between trafficking and actually prostitution. I mean, last year, Feminist Economist published a special issue on sex worker and trafficking, stating that there is lots of moralities going on in Europe because most of the countries actually have banned making illegal prostitution. But what's going on actually is that prostitution is becoming a business. I mean, it's one of the oldest business, we knew that, but we have data that actually prove that it's very, very much profitable business, much more than drugs. So my question here, going back to the solution and the policy credibility, is how can you make that link between trafficking and sex worker less moral and actually more practical in order to stop trafficking? Thank you.
I can actually give you a quick and simple answer to how do we define slavery. But I also have to warn you that if you go out and look, you'll find that almost every law in the world defines it differently, as do most academics and so forth. But we don't actually have to define modern slavery or human trafficking, because at the core of both of those is something called slavery. And slavery's been today what it has always been in the past. It's the complete control of one person by another person. And the point of that control is exploitation, primarily economic, but often sexual, and often both. So it's not about is someone paid or not. It's not about necessarily even the working conditions. It's about can they have any control over their own lives. And in 5,000 years ago, people in slavery had no control of their lives, and people today have no control over their lives. Survivors of slavery taught me something I found really powerful, which is they said, the people in the laws don't understand that there are two things about being in slavery that are very intense when you're in slavery. One is that you become aspatial, and what I mean by that is you can't move anywhere. You're under physical control. You have no freedom of movement. So you can't even begin to think about where you might go or what you might do. And the other is that you become atemporal. In other words, time loses its meaning for you. Because the thing that we all do as human beings every day, which is to think into the future, is denied to a person in slavery. But people who have come out of slavery say to me, people don't get it. They don't understand what it means to live in a world where you never think of the future, where you have no control over your own time, and you have no control over your own space. And when people begin to understand that, they've said to me, then people will begin to truly understand and perhaps correctly define slavery.
But to be honest, I think the definitional problem provides part of the answer to the issue about prostitution and sex trafficking. And these are big, complicated issues in this space. I don't really like wandering into this because there are such strong, particularly in the US, but more broadly, such strong ideological views on prostitution, even calling it prostitution as opposed to sex work, and sex workers and so on. But if you look at the definition of slavery as, one person controlling another, and a perpetrator exploiting someone else, I think for me, that gives me the kind of entry point, which is, sex slavery, what we call, or commercial sexual exploitation, is where someone is controlled and by a perpetrator, not by circumstances, not because, no one ever wants to willingly engage in sex work, but you're talking about one person physically controlling and mentally controlling another, for me. There are very, very difficult debates about what is right, what is wrong. Should you criminalise prostitution as a way of reducing the pool of potential people who are being trafficked into the space? Others will argue, well, you know, people have a right to work in certain ways if that's all they want to do, and by criminalising it, you drive it underground. The very big problem we have is there's no good data, partly because those that are researching often come from ideological perspectives, and we need better data about what impact the policies have. If you, for instance, criminalise prostitution, does it reduce the scale of trafficking or not? Because in the end, I think that should be driving the policy responses.
Anyone wants to take the question, how can people disappear in a narrative? It was a comment? Okay. Then I'll open up. If there are any more questions, I see two, Frédéric, and then there's one in the back. And then these will be our last questions unless there's anybody burning with a really important question before we close up.
So, thanks for this stunning movie this evening. My first question would be rather for you. You were mentioning that slavery was a control of somebody and he's losing time. Then my second question, the question would be, do you take into account also the government slavery? For example, one of the biggest one in China with the Lao guys, or in Russia, and do you take this number into account? Because then I think the amount of 40 million is a little bit underestimated. And then the second question would be for you. We see in this movie an extreme violence of the people who are, and extremely local activities. So I was wondering, can a non-profit organization or a government fight against these people? Because you would need very local laws, you would need very local actions, and the result would be really in tiny pieces.
The quick answer is yes, we do include ideas about state-sponsored slavery and the counts in places like China. But the truth of it is, China is very quiet and closed-mouthed and will not let researchers in to look at the Laogai. We know it goes on, this enslavement without due, it's fundamentally a legal system, but there is no due process. So some people are not even arrested, they're just taken and then put into a prison factory, and then they're enslaved there by the state, fundamentally. So this occurs, and we're trying our best to find ways to measure it, but as you can imagine, this is a very difficult thing to measure. We see this not just in the normal Laogai, but if you go to northwest China and you look at people like the Uyghur people, who are now under an enormous pressure by the Chinese government to conform and to walk away from their faiths and so forth. They're taking lots of them away simply on false charges to put into the system as well. So we do measure it, but we measure conservatively, and we try to never exaggerate and only go on the data we can get.
Yeah, I mean, responding to your question about, well, this kind of localized violence and what can NGOs do. I mean, I think one of the key things about the movie is that activity could only take place under the protection of the law, right? It was because of corrupt police that were providing protection, and in so many of the places we work, it's because the laws are not enforced. Everything that happened in that movie is illegal, right? So it's happening because laws are not being enforced, and NGOs do have a role to play. We support NGOs, local organisations in India to hire lawyers to bring case after case after case. Most of those cases don't succeed. Pushing the police to actually go ahead with prosecutions. When the prosecutions are successful, pushing the police to actually then incarcerate the individuals who are paying bribes all the way through. And it's only by that repeated pressure that over time you change the systems. You change the norms that accept that this behaviour can go on, so that suddenly it can not suddenly, but over time, it becomes unacceptable. So that's the role that civil society has to play, is to change behaviour and change the systems, and that's the only way, in the end, that we can stamp it out in situations like that we've witnessed in this movie.
Any other questions tonight, or shall we wrap up after that one? All right, thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the film and for sponsoring this evening. Quite a lesson for us all, I think. Something that we're not faced with every day, and I think the film tells a story here, and the storytelling will help you to do what you need to do to bring this story to life. I want to go back to what the gentleman was talking about, because as a parent, I was thinking the exact same thing. If I'm in the position of the Indians, and I'm expecting my daughter to be somewhere, and she's kidnapped or whatever, what is it that a parent can do to bring pressure to this system, to track, to work with the authorities, bring pressure on the authorities? Are there NGOs in place that help this type of thing? Just really from the perspective of a parent, if something like this happens, or someone that you know is involved in this, how do you approach the system? What do you do?
Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question, actually. So.
I mean, the reality is that most of those that are exploited are vulnerable, right? It's not usually the middle class girl or boy. It does happen, it absolutely does happen, but the vast majority are vulnerable. Migrants, foster care kids, runaways, but in situations where people are, for instance, where someone is trafficked and there's a family or people that are seeking to respond, there are various ways, and it depends where you are. In the US, there's a national counter-trafficking hotline. We saw the number up there. There are NGOs, there are police forces, the more scrutiny. And I suspect for the most part, traffickers tend to avoid people that actually have those networks because there are much higher risks. In places like India, it's just beyond horrible because, I've been to villages where parents tell me that someone came into the village and offered their children jobs to support the parents, and these children just went off and you've disappeared in a country of 1 billion people. And it really is hard then to find a way to get them back. There are NGOs across, and we support 50 NGOs in India, but it's still a drop in the ocean, so it can be really, really challenging. And part of what we need to do is build these networks. I mean, our ambition at the Freedom Fund over the next, and you hear it here, over the next 7 years is to build a movement of NGOs globally. And we're going to start investing in building a much, much bigger movement, because I think in the end that's what we feel is needed to address some of the real challenges in this space.
I wanted to actually add, if I may, we talked earlier about how it was getting more prominence in the media, and I know that social media, for example, is one of the mediums that parents have found very useful when their children disappear.
I was just going to answer you directly in a slightly lighthearted way, which seems a strange way to answer that question, is that if I look at one of the films about human trafficking that I didn't think much of, Taken, the fundamental answer of that film and the fundamental model that film offers us, Taken, not this film, is that yes, we can stop slavery as long as every dad becomes a slightly psychopathic ex-CIA agent who has unlimited resources and weapons training and parachute training and so forth, who can then chase traffickers around the world and kill them.
You don't have that training?
I thought, no, oh, darn. Right, but the point being, that kind of crazy white savior hero notion is one that we really have to lay to rest. And it's not a simplistic plot device that gets people out of slavery. It's the NGOs. I'll come back to that and say, if you want to find the people who are putting their lives on the line, it's the NGOs. And the few times in India when we've been able to find children who disappeared from villages, it's been working with local NGOs. And that's about it. But, karate training, Could have.
Thank you. Conrad.
Well, thank you, Olivia, because we wouldn't be here without you. And this is why we made the film, to have experts answer all the questions for us and point us in the right direction. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Conroy, for coming and joining us and telling us about the film and enabling us to show it tonight. It is the first time it's being shown in Brussels. So you're all really, really lucky because you're the first people in Brussels to see this film. So go out and talk about it. Nick, thanks so much for your continuous cooperation. Kevin, for being here with us today and incentivizing us to have these discussions and putting out there. The bar is open. You're welcome to stick around, have a little drink. Some of the speakers will be with us. But anyway, thank you so much for coming tonight. And I hope if it wasn't fun, it was at least interesting and eye-opening. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.